the first light of dawn painted the valley in muted gold. A thin mist clung to the grass, curling around fence posts and the weathered boards of the Whitmore estate. The air smelled faintly of dew and wildflowers, carried on the gentle breeze that swept through the open meadows. Clara Whitmore, 8 years old, sat cross-legged in the barn doorway with a sketchbook balanced on her knees. Her pencil moved in careful strokes, tracing the outline of a white horse grazing beyond the paddock. That horse, named Aspen, was unlike any other on the property. His coat was pure as new fallen snow, his mane long and silken, and his dark eyes seemed to hold the weight of quiet understanding. Aspen had belonged to Clara's late mother. The horse had been at her mother's side long before Clara was born, and since the woman's untimely death, Aspen had become Clara's silent guardian. Clara's father, Charles Whitmore, was a man who could silence a room simply by entering it. He was tall, always impeccably dressed, with a jaw carved in granite and a voice that left no room for argument. He made his fortune in railroads and mining, but he wore his wealth like armor, shielding himself from sentiment, from warmth, from anything that might weaken him. To the townsfolk, Charles was a man of prestige and power. But to Clara, he was a stranger who shared her house and set rules she could never quite understand. He was a father in name, but not in spirit. That morning, Charles appeared in the barn doorway, his boots clicking against the wooden floor. "Clara," he said, voice clipped. "Put your things away. We're going for a ride." Clara glanced up, surprised. Her father rarely took her anywhere himself. "Where to?" she asked. "Just get ready," he replied, turning away without meeting her eyes. Aspen's head lifted as if he sensed something in Charles's tone. Clara rose slowly, brushing hay from her skirt. She felt a flicker of unease, but told herself it was nothing, just another morning in the sprawling, quiet loneliness of the Whitmore estate. The morning sun was still low when Charles led Clara toward the carriage waiting at the edge of the drive. The black stallion hitched to it snorted impatiently, steam curling from its nostrils in the cool air. Aspen was still in the paddock, ears pricked forward, his gaze locked on Clara as though he sensed something was wrong. Clara glanced over her shoulder at him, offering a small smile before climbing into the carriage. She didn't know why her stomach felt tight, why her hands wouldn't stay still in her lap. Charles didn't speak as the driver flicked the reins, and the wheels creaked over the gravel. The Whitmore estate fell away behind them, replaced by rolling hills and thickets of pine. Clara tried to make conversation, asking about school, about whether they could visit the bakery in town, but her father answered in curt, distracted sentences. After nearly an hour, the road narrowed, the trees closing in until they were riding beneath a canopy of tangled branches. The air here was cooler, and a hush fell over the woods. The only sound was the rhythmic clop of hooves and the faint rattle of the carriage wheels. Finally, the carriage stopped in a clearing by a weathered hunting cabin, one Clara had never seen before. The driver climbed down without a word, opened the door, and gestured for Clara to step out. She looked at her father, confused. "Why are we here?" "There's something I need you to do," Charles said. His tone was calm, almost rehearsed. "You're going to stay here for a while. It's safer this way." "Safer? From what?" Clara asked, her voice trembling. But instead of answering, Charles reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather satchel. He pressed it into her hands. Inside, she felt the weight of coins, gold, not paper, and a folded piece of paper she didn't recognize. "You'll have food here. Someone will check on you." His voice was flat, devoid of the softness a father's reassurance should have carried. Clara's eyes darted from the lonely cabin to the endless woods. "I don't understand. Can I stay home?" "I can help." "This isn't up for debate," Charles interrupted sharply. "Do as you're told." She froze, feeling the sting of tears, but nodded. Charles turned to the driver. "Let's go." "Wait," Clara stepped forward, reaching for his sleeve. "How long will I be here?" But he pulled away, climbed back into the carriage, and without looking back, signaled the driver to leave. The sound of hooves faded into the trees, leaving Clara standing alone with the satchel pressed against her chest. The cabin loomed beside her, its shutters closed, the wood gray and splintered with age. She had never felt so small, so abandoned. Back at the Whitmore estate, Aspen had been restless from the moment the carriage departed. He paced the paddock, ears swiveling toward the sound of the wind as though listening for something only he could hear. When the carriage returned hours later, this time without Clara, Aspen's head shot up. His eyes followed Charles as the man strode toward the house. The driver led the black stallion to the stable, but there was no sign of the small figure Aspen had been waiting for. The white horse let out a sharp, questioning snort, then moved to the gate. His nostrils flared, catching a faint trace of Clara's scent lingering on the wind, mixed with the sharp tang of pine and the distant must of old wood. His muscles tightened. He knew she wasn't here. That night, Aspen refused his feed. He stood at the far end of the paddock, gaze fixed on the dark line of trees beyond the estate, the same direction the carriage had taken. His tail flicked against the cool night air, and in his dark, intelligent eyes, something had shifted. Because whatever had happened that morning, Aspen understood one thing: Clara was gone, and she had not gone willingly. The Whitmore estate lay silent under a moonless sky. The lanterns on the porch had burned down to a breath of ember. Wind moved through the poplars like a whisper that didn't want to be heard. In the far paddock, Aspen stood statue still, his white coat a pale ghost in the dark. He had waded through the day, searching every path with his ears, turning at each creak of leather or scrape of wheel as if Clara might step out of the dusk the way she always did, shoelaces undone, hair full of hay, a pencil tucked behind one ear. She did not come. Past midnight, something in him decided waiting was a mistake. Aspen laid his chest to the gate. The top rail flexed, groaned, and sprang back. He stepped away, measured the height, and tried again, harder. Wood squealed. Another shove. A nail spat into the dirt. The third push splintered the rail enough for him to lift and wedge his shoulder through. He wrenched sideways, felt the sharp bite of a strand along his flank, and then he was through, staggering a step, free. He stood listening. The house ticked and settled. No shout came. No stable hand stirred. Aspen turned his head toward the black line of trees, the same line the carriage had swallowed in the morning, and moved. He didn't gallop. He went into a ground-eating trot, hooves whispering over the road like a drum practiced not to wake the house. The air was cold enough to burn his lungs. He liked it. It made the world simple, edges sharpened, sense clean. The road still held the days-old stories: iron from the carriage rims, sweat from a dark stallion that had been driven hard despite cool weather, a trace of cigar smoke if the wind angled right. Beneath that, faint but stubborn, a small, familiar thread: sun-bleached cotton, graphite smudge, wildflower oil Clara stole from the washroom because it reminded her of her mother. He followed that one. The land changed as he moved, white fences thinning to split rails, pastures giving way to scrub and pine. The sound of the valley faded until all that remained was his own breath and the soft knock of hoof on packed earth. A fox bounded across the road with an old rabbit in its mouth and froze when it saw him, then vanished into the dark. Somewhere far off, a coyote called and another answered. Aspen kept on. Barbed wire crossed the road where Whitmore land ended. He didn't slow. He angled along the ditch to a low place he knew from a boyhood of roaming, where wire bent close to the ground and blackberry canes hit a gap. He put his weight on the posts until a staple spat free and slipped through the thorny curtain, leaving a white hair or two for the brambles to keep. Down in the creek bottom, the road dissolved into ruts and rocks. Water muttered over stone, black on black. Aspen dropped his head to test the current, then stepped in. The first shock of cold tightened every muscle along his belly and back, but he went carefully, feeling with his 4 feet for depth and slickness, judging the push of water against the hollow of his legs. Midstream, moonlight came free of a cloud and laid a strip of silver on the surface that hung from his knees like silk. He climbed out, shook once, and moved again, leaving the creek to carry his scent away. By the time the trees gave way to a small clearing, the eastern edge of the sky had paled enough to separate branch from branch. There was a cabin tucked there, weathered gray, shutters closed, chimney dark. Its door wore a padlock and the windows had been boarded from the inside. Aspen stopped at the edge of the grass and stood with his head high, nostrils trembling. Clara. It wasn't a smell that could be put into human words. It was the shape of a life rubbed into wood and cloth, the thread of her scarf, the sugar from her fingers, the soap the housekeeper used that Clara hated because it bit her skin. All of it braided together and tugging at him from behind those boards. He circled the cabin once. The yard was swept flat by old wind. The outhouse door crooked as though it had been kicked too many times by impatient men. Behind the cabin, under a low window, something paler than the wall showed at the seam of shutter and sill. Aspen stepped closer. A length of torn ribbon, blue, faded, snagged on a splinter and tangled with a strand of hair the color of straw and shade. Clara had tied ribbons to his halter when she was smaller and giggled at how grand he looked like a soldier. He nosed the strip, drew her scent into the warm spaces behind his eyes where understanding lived. He bumped the shutter once. It rattled like a lie. Inside, there was no motion. No light. Very faintly, he thought he heard the smallest scrape, like someone turning on wooden boards. He breathed and waited. Silence answered. Aspen moved to the door. The padlock was iron and old, the kind whose key had bitten more pockets than its worth. He pushed his shoulder into the wood. The door held. He stepped back, shook his mane once, and turned his head toward the dark beyond the clearing. If he could not open the cabin, he would bring something that could. He set off again, leaving the clearing behind, and cut across the trees to a wagon track that angled toward town. As he moved, the sky lightened by degrees, indigo to blue bruised to the pale that makes birds consider song. He lengthened his stride where the ground allowed, saved himself where rocks demanded care. A nail in his left hind began to sing with each landing, a thin metallic note. He bore it. The town lay in the basin, streets drawing straight lines that barns and houses obediently obeyed. A dog barked when he took the alley behind the bakery. The smell of old flour dust and last night's ash clung to the bricks. Aspen passed the church and the well and did not stop until he reached the small house with the peeling porch and the porch swing that talked in tired creaks when evening cooled, May Caldwell's place. May had been there when Clara's mother died, hands steady, voice low, a woman who knew which end of sorrow to hold so it didn't burn you. May mended people without fussing about the way they'd gotten broken. She was also the one person Aspen allowed to touch him besides Clara. He climbed the steps to the porch and thudded his chest lightly against the door. The sound echoed inside the small rooms. He waited, then did it again. The latch rattled. A lamp flared. What in? The sound came first, low, rolling, gathering weight. Hoofbeats. More than two this time. Whoever was coming had decided that subtlety was no longer necessary. Aspen's ears locked forward, his muscles tightening under the sheen of his white coat. He shifted his weight, not in fear, but in preparation. The street outside the sheriff's office was narrow, flanked by hitching posts and the front porches of weathered buildings. He moved into the center, a white wall between whatever was coming and the door Clara had just walked through. Inside, Sheriff Avery read the document May had handed him, his brow knitting with each line. When he reached the end, he exhaled sharply. May, he said, looking up, this isn't just some land deed or inheritance paper. This is proof that Clara's mother was the rightful owner of the Whitmore estate and the mines her father's been bleeding dry for years. May's eyes narrowed. So he took her to keep anyone from knowing she had a claim? Exactly, Avery said. If she's recognized as the heir, the estate, and half the wealth in this county, passes to her when she turns 18. He's been hiding that, and hiding her, because if anyone in court sees this, he tapped the paper. His empire is dust. Clara, sitting quietly in a chair by the wall, stared at the floor. He said it was for my safety. That men would come for me. But he was lying the whole time. Her voice trembled, but there was steel under it now. The sheriff crouched so he could meet her eyes. We can make this right. But we'll need to be smart. Your father will come for you, and when he does, we'll be ready. May's gaze flicked toward the window. I'd say he's on his way now. The hoofbeats were close enough to rattle the glass. Outside, Aspen's eyes tracked the dust cloud rounding the bend. A dozen riders, led by Charles Whitmore himself, black coats snapping behind him like the shadow of a vulture's wing. His face was set in a mask of control, but the tension in his jaw betrayed him. Out of the way! Charles shouted, yanking back on his stallion's reins when he saw Aspen standing square in the road. The white horse didn't move. From the boardwalk, townsfolk watched, murmuring. They all knew Aspen, and most had seen him only ever with Clara. That he was here, blocking Charles, told them something they couldn't quite name, but felt deep in their bones. Move that animal, or I'll, Charles began, but his voice faltered as Aspen stepped forward, slow and deliberate. His hooves rang on the packed earth like hammer blows. Avery pushed open the sheriff's door, stepping out with May and Clara behind him. Clara clutched the edge of May's shawl, her small frame barely visible behind the older woman. Mr. Whitmore, Avery called, his voice carrying easily over the mutter of the crowd. We've got some questions for you. Why don't you dismount and come inside? Charles's eyes flicked from Avery to Clara, then to the paper still in the sheriff's hand. His gaze hardened. That's my daughter. You've got no right to keep her from me. Avery stepped down off the boardwalk. Funny thing, kidnapping's a crime, even if it's your own blood. And hiding legal documents that prove she owns more than half your holdings? That's called fraud. A ripple moved through the crowd, words like fraud and crime stuck fast when spoken in the center of town. Charles shifted in the saddle, looking as though he might bolt, but Aspen moved then, sidestepping just enough to block the only clear way back down the street. The move was so subtle, so natural, that no man watching could say it was deliberate, but everyone felt it was. Sheriff, you've got no proof, Charles said, voice tightening. On the contrary, Avery replied, holding up the folded document. We've got all the proof we need. And a witness. At that, Clara stepped forward, surprising even May. She spoke clearly, her voice small but steady. You locked me in that cabin. You said no one could know about Mama's letters. You said if they did, you'd lose everything. The words landed like a slap. Charles's stallion shifted under him, uneasy. Avery didn't give him a chance to recover. Charles Whitmore, you're under arrest for kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, and fraud. Dismount. The crowd closed in just enough to make escape impossible without trampling neighbors. Aspen held his ground, eyes fixed on Charles, as though daring him to try. For a moment, Charles's hands twitched on the reins. Then, with a sharp breath, he swung down from the saddle. Avery stepped forward, cuffing him while the crowd watched in tense silence. As the sheriff led Charles toward the jailhouse, Aspen exhaled through his nostrils, the sound loud in the still air. Clara moved to him immediately, pressing her face into his neck. You didn't let him get away, she whispered. And in that moment, everyone knew the arrest had been made possible not just by paper and testimony, but by a white horse who had refused to move. 3 weeks later, the Whitmore trial began. The courthouse, normally a quiet building where land disputes and cattle theft were sorted out, had never held so many people. Farmers came in their Sunday coats, shopkeepers closed early, even ranch hands with dust still on their boots stood shoulder to shoulder in the gallery. Word had spread far beyond the valley, about the billionaire who'd hidden his own daughter to protect a secret fortune, about the old document that proved the estate belonged to her, and about the white horse who had brought the truth to light. Inside, Clara sat in the front row beside May, her small hands folded tightly in her lap. Aspen was tethered just outside, standing in the shade of a cottonwood, visible through the tall windows. The sheriff had arranged it so Clara could see him if she turned her head. She did, often. Charles Whitmore stood at the defense table, still impeccably dressed but without the easy arrogance that used to hang from his shoulders like a tailored coat. His lawyers spoke in polished tones about misunderstandings and family matters, but each time Clara's voice echoed in the courtroom, repeating the truth she had lived, those words sounded thinner. When the old document was presented, the judge examined the faded ink and cracked wax seal with the care of someone holding the hinge of a family's future. He looked from the paper to Charles, and in his eyes was no sympathy. Testimony came from May, from Eli, from Sheriff Avery, and even from townsfolk who'd seen the carriage that day and remembered it returning without Clara. The story pieced together like a fence rebuilt after a storm, every rail fitting into place until there was no way through it. Outside, Aspen shifted his weight, ears swiveling toward the courthouse doors. A boy approached with a bucket of water, which the horse accepted politely before returning to his steady vigil. He didn't know what laws or trials were, but he understood waiting for someone he loved, and he would wait as long as it took. By the 4th day, the verdict was inevitable. The jury returned after less than an hour of deliberation. The foreman, a rancher with hands the size of shovels, rose and spoke. We find the defendant guilty on all charges. The room seemed to exhale all at once. Clara looked at May, who placed a steady hand on her shoulder. Charles didn't meet his daughter's eyes as the bailiff led him away in shackles. The judge's final order was clear: custody of Clara would go to May Caldwell until she came of age, and full ownership of the Whitmore estate and its assets would revert to Clara when she turned 18. The mines, the land, and the house that had once been her mother's would be hers again. When they stepped out into the sunlight, the crowd followed, spilling onto the courthouse steps. Aspen lifted his head the instant Clara appeared. She ran the last few steps to him, her arms wrapping around his neck in a fierce, wordless embrace. You came for me, she whispered. You always will. The sheriff cleared his throat and spoke loud enough for the crowd to hear. Folks, I reckon we've seen a rare thing, justice done, and done right. But I'll tell you something, if not for this horse, we might not be here. Aspen didn't just find Clara, he brought the truth to our door. There was a murmur of agreement, then applause, scattered at first, then swelling until it filled the street. Someone stepped forward with a length of blue ribbon, tying it gently into Aspen's mane. It fluttered in the breeze like a badge of honor. Weeks later, life found a new rhythm. Clara moved into May's home, where the mornings began with fresh bread and the smell of coffee instead of silence. She returned to her sketching, and Aspen was never far, sometimes grazing in the meadow, sometimes standing by the porch steps as though guarding the doorway itself. The Whitmore estate, though still standing, no longer felt like a fortress. It was just land and wood now, waiting for the day Clara might decide what to do with it. The mines were placed under fair management, profits held in trust for her future. In the evenings, Clara would sit on the porch with May, sketchbook on her lap, while Aspen grazed nearby. She drew him often, not just the curve of his neck or the set of his ears, but the way he had looked that morning in the street, unyielding and sure, the day her life had changed. One cool autumn evening, Clara closed her sketchbook and looked at May. "Do you think he knew? That it would all turn out this way?" May smiled faintly. "I think he knew you were in trouble. And I think he knew he'd never stop until you were safe. Sometimes that's all you need to change the ending." Clara rested her cheek against Aspen's shoulder. "Then that's what I'll remember. Not just that he saved me, but that he stayed, when no one else did." The sun slipped behind the hills, leaving the sky painted in deep orange and soft purple. Aspen lifted his head toward the fading light, the ribbon in his mane stirring with the wind. And for the first time in months, Clara felt certain that whatever storms might come, she would not face them alone. Sometimes, the greatest courage isn't in the fight, it's in standing your ground until the truth has no choice but to be seen.